Um, so let me just go back a little bit to just a really quick reminder. My name is Tom Perot, and I'm in the Department of Geography and the Environment at Syracuse. And my research is in environmental justice. I do most of my work in actually in South America. I've done a lot of work in Bolivia and in Ecuador, looking at environmental justice and in a field called political ecology. So looking at the political background of kind of environmental conflicts and environmental decision making. So a little bit different from policy, but sort of more connected to the politics and the political economy of environment. And I also have done some work in Syracuse, and I've lived in Syracuse now for over 20 years. So I've become pretty familiar with a lot of the issues around here. So I want to present a little bit of just background in terms of what environmental justice is and how I think about environmental justice as a geographer. And then what I want to do is present a little bit more about my, there we go, okay, about my work. Sorry, I'm kind of messing around with my screen a little bit. Some of this was hidden. So, okay, there we go. So first of all, I want to kind of emphasize that thinking geographically, and I do want to kind of emphasize that I am a geographer. So partly this is a little bit about the geographic way of thinking about environmental justice. And so thinking geographically about environmental justice means understanding that environmental justice or environmental injustice is really a relationship between places. So what I'm getting at is kind of the idea of thinking spatially. So not just thinking about sort of random occurrences or about purely environmental processes or purely social processes, but thinking spatially about these is the relationship between what happens in one place and what happens in another. And this is illustrated in these slides by looking at the oil production, oil extraction in one area, and the need then to refine that. So that's a photograph in the lower right-hand corner of an oil refinery in the community of Richmond, California, which is sort of north and east of San Francisco a little bit, in a low-income area. It's a predominantly Latino and African-American community, and there's a large oil refinery complex in that area. And of course that leads to highway building. Highways oftentimes in urban areas were put in the middle of urban neighborhoods, oftentimes kind of moving out or even destroying some of the houses that are in the way. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. And then in order to provide a living space in suburban area for people out and further away from urban areas that can live in these more dispersed neighborhoods that rely on cars, right? The suburban neighborhood type that we have really relies on oil and on gasoline, which means that it also relies on these other kinds of landscapes of refineries, of highways, and of oil extraction. So the relationship between what happens in one place is connected to what happens in other places. Okay. Oops, sorry. Let me go back. Okay, so this is another picture that kind of illustrates the same thing with coal. So instead of oil, with coal extraction, that's a picture of mountaintop removal coal extraction in the Appalachians, and then that leads to allows people to burn coal, which leads to and then need to transmit electricity and the ability to then light people's houses. And so the relationship between local processes, the ability to light our houses, to turn on the electricity and have electricity in our houses, is connected to these other things that are not so local, right? So these extra local or regional or national or international processes. And so what a geographer would call it, the connection between scales, between spatial scales, the local, the regional, the national, or the international. And of course, this particular example has broader ramifications in terms of climate change also. So it's important to kind of keep those connections in mind as well. So these kinds of spatial processes manifest themselves in lots of different ways. So one particular way is through the the spatial patterns of environmental benefits and environmental, what could be called environmental goods and environmental bads, or environmental benefits and environmental harms in urban areas. And these oftentimes map onto racialized spaces, right? So this is a series of maps of Providence, Rhode Island, that show on the upper left-hand side is the percent of non-white population. So the darker the block, these are I believe census blocks. So the darker the census block, the greater the percentage of non-white or people of color. And so what you can see is that in that sort of southwestern side of Providence is the highest concentration of communities of color, with in the kind of north central, a couple neighborhoods where you also have pretty high percentage of communities of color. And then the other maps in different ways show either environmental benefits or environmental harms. So one is tree cover. So we can think about tree cover as an environmental benefit. Everybody likes to have trees and green space in their neighborhood. They provide shade, they provide habitat for birds and for squirrels. They're pretty to look at in the fall, they turn colors. So everybody likes to have tree cover. And if you look at where the tree cover is in the city compared to where the communities of color are, you'll notice really quickly that the communities of color have a relatively low level of tree cover. They don't have as much urban forest as the outlying whiter communities, right? You can see also patterns with pollution violations. So these are things like small scale spills from industrial centers or from homes, or various kinds of things that get recorded that are violations of either Clean Water or Clean Air Act. And so you can see that these tend to be clustered also around communities of color, either in the Southwest or in the central, kind of north central area. And then lead poisoning, which is mostly from lead paint. It could also be from lead pipes in plumbing, similar kind of patterns. So that the communities of color tend to be disproportionately burdened with environmental harms, lead poisoning and pollution, and also disproportionately have a disproportionate lack of access to environmental benefits like tree cover. We can see a similar pattern in New York City. If you look at these two maps, the map on the left is the ethnic composition. So where you've got the yellow blocks, that's a whiter population. Where you've got the sort of greenish grayish blocks, that's Black or African American. And then the sort of pink blocks are predominantly Hispanic or Latino. And then where it's sort of the beige, it's kind of a mix where no group has more than 50%. So what you see is that Manhattan and Staten Island, and then that southern part of Brooklyn tend to be pretty white, with a large Latino or Hispanic population in the Bronx. And then parts of Brooklyn and parts of Queens are largely Black or African American. And if you look at the map on the right that shows asthma cases by zip code, this is a slightly different scale. I think the first map is census blocks and the second one is zip codes. But regardless, what they're showing is a very stark pattern where you have communities of color, you have a much higher instance of asthma. Asthma tends to be caused primarily by air pollution, by exposure to irritants in the air, and also by a lot of other sort of pre-existing stresses, right? And so what happens then is that this becomes a really good indicator of environmental harms, particularly around air pollution, right? And so people that live near factories, near highways, near polluting facilities tend to be burdened with a higher instance of asthma. And so in New York City, the very best predictor of whether or not you or your children are likely to have asthma is your zip code, where you live, and the color of your skin. And so depending on if you live in the Bronx or you live in certain sections of Brooklyn and you're African American or you're Latino, you have a much higher probability of having asthma than if you're white and you live in Staten Island or in Manhattan. The other thing about thinking about environmental justice like a geographer, thinking geographically about these processes, is understanding that space and place, where we live, and the spaces that we live our lives in are always racialized. Okay, so what do I mean by that? These are two maps that are of Syracuse. The first is a 1938 Syracuse, the redlining map. So this is a map that was made in the 1930s to indicate where what communities would have access to loans for mortgages and what communities wouldn't. And if you were in one of those communities that's marked green, you had a really good chance of being able to get a mortgage to buy a house in that neighborhood. If you were in blue, maybe not quite so much, yellow a little bit harder, and the reds, in the red communities, those were where you couldn't get a mortgage at all. And what indicated that? Well, those were communities primarily of people of color, primarily African-American, but also at that time, some Jewish communities and foreign-born Italians and other immigrant communities. Those communities that had African Americans and other people that were seen as not desirable by the government were what's called redline. They were blocked off and they were prohibited from being able to get mortgages to buy homes. And what you find is that those same neighborhoods in 2012 are still African American. So you find overwhelmingly that in Syracuse, the African Americans are concentrated in on the south side and the near west side. Okay, and so those are the communities that, as we'll see in a little bit, tend to be burdened disproportionately with a lot of environmental harms, right? So these spaces are not just neutral, socially neutral spaces, but they are always already racialized as in the way that they experience environmental harms. Okay, and here's another map. It's just it's a kind of a dot density map of Syracuse, or sorry, of New York City, of course, that shows this kind of racial segregation really starkly. I'm not going to talk about this a whole lot, but I just wanted to show that because it does a really nice job of showing racial segregation, that people tend not to live in communities that are integrated. They tend to live in New York City and in Syracuse and in most cities in the United States in pretty segregated cities. And so the spaces that we live in tend to be fairly racialized. Okay. The field of environmental justice, you could, if it has sort of an origin story, then Robert Bullard is sort of the main origin, the main point of origin. Robert Bullard is a sociologist who was sort of, can be seen as the founding father of environmental justice in the United States. And he defined environmental racism as any policy, practice, or directive that differentially affects or disadvantages, whether intended or unintended, individuals, groups, or communities based on race or color, right? So this is fairly straightforward, but I wanted to emphasize the idea of it being intended or unintended. Oftentimes we think of racism and environmental racism as being part of that as only ever being intentional actions, right? That we think of racism as being what somebody intends for something to happen. So an act of racial bias or racial animus or hostility towards a group that somebody doesn't like. But what Robert Bullard emphasizes, and what I would emphasize too, is that these processes don't necessarily need to be intended. They can also be unintended in the sense that they can be predictable outcomes even if they're not intended. Right? So this is what we would call structural environmental racism, or structural processes, where the outcomes are sort of baked into the rules and are a predictable outcome, even if they're not an intended outcome. The other part of that I would emphasize is that one size doesn't fit all. So this is kind of the difference between equity and equality. Equity is helping people to meet the needs, knowing that their needs might be a little bit different. Equality is sort of a one size fits all approach, where you provide everybody with the same beginning or the same policies, assuming that they all have the same opportunities in life. But as we know, not everybody has the same opportunities. So we can talk about this a little bit later if you want, but I'd like to move on to the examples. And I'll kind of move through these a little bit quickly so that we have time for discussion and questions afterwards. So these are, the first three are all about primarily about Syracuse. The first two are only about Syracuse. The third one, lead contamination, has to do with Syracuse, but it also has to do with, it's relevant to other places too. And then the climate change and urban heat islands is another issue that that I think is related to environmental justice, that I have examples from other places outside of Syracuse, but I think it would relate to Syracuse as well. So let's talk about that. I'm sure that everybody has visited Onondaga Lake. You know Onondaga Lake very well. Onondaga Lake is a beautiful place. It's an important place historically and culturally, especially for the Onondaga people who live in the city and around Syracuse, and the Onondaga Territory, of course, is south of Syracuse. But Onondaga Lake is a Superfund site. That means a Superfund site is a site that's been designated as highly polluted, and there's a lot of money coming in from the federal government and from private entities, in this case from Honeywell Corporation, to clean up the lake. And I don't have time to go into all of the history of that. If people are wondering a little bit about the history of pollution in Onondaga Lake, be happy to talk about that afterwards in the question time. But there was a lot of industry, heavy industry, and particularly a chemical industry, chemical plants on that, that western kind of south western shore of the lake, right over here by Willis Avenue and stuff. And so what happened was that there was a lot of waste beds. And so from about the 1890s up through the 1980s was a period when there was a lot of activity, a lot of production, industrial activity, and dumping of waste. And initially that wasn't, it was sort of a chalky, inert waste, but then at the beginning in about the 1920s, it started being chemical waste, things like mercury, and then later on, as they diversified the chemical manufacturing, things like PCBs, and various other kinds of chemicals that are really harmful. The worst ones of all are the mercury sediments, because mercury is a highly, highly toxic heavy metal. And so if it gets into organisms, if it gets into people, it can cause a lot of damage. And it stays in organisms and works its way up the food chain. And so it can affect predators and fish and birds and other organisms, and of course, people that might eat those fish. And so this is a good example of that. Here's just a sign at Onondaga Lake that you can see these signs. There's a number of them up around the lake, which is warning people about eating fish. If you eat one fish, it's probably not so bad, but they do recommend that if you're a pregnant woman, or if you're a child, or if you've got other health concerns, you shouldn't eat fish. And if you are a healthy male, you probably shouldn't eat too many fish. So, so you've got to be sort of careful. And it's important to note too, in this sign, it's in a number of different languages, right? So English, obviously, and Spanish, and then I believe Burmese, and I am not sure what the other is a South Asian language. I'm not sure if that's Hindi or exactly which language, but this is because we have in Syracuse, we have a large immigrant and refugee population. And refugees, when they come to Syracuse and other places in the US, are pretty low income. And so they don't really have a lot of money to buy food. And a lot of people are used to living in places where they catch fish as part of their subsistence. That means that they catch fish to eat the fish, bring a fish home, and they sort of rely on that as a food source. A lot of, if I were to go to a Onondaga Lake, I might go fishing just for recreation and catch the fish and let them go. And that would be fun for me, probably not so fun for the fish, but it's sort of a form of recreation. But for a lot of people, they really rely on this as a source of food. So it affects the chemical wastes, are a chemical legacy, a pollution legacy that still affects people today. It also affects people throughout the watershed, people and environments. And I've got a good example of that. So this is an old picture. It's sort of a painting drawing of, this was actually a postcard. I think it's a colorized photograph of the Solvay Process Company, which was the original industrial plant on that southwestern shore of the lake. And it produced a thing called soda ash, which was still is a very important feedstock that's a basic ingredient in a lot of manufacturing. They used it to make ceramics and glass and other kinds of industrial products. And one of the key ingredients in making soda ash was salt. And that's why the chemical plant, why the chemical industry established itself in Syracuse anyway. As you know, Syracuse is the salt city. And so there's a lot of salt deposits, there were salt springs, and there were big salt domes under the lake and under Syracuse and stretching down into the Tully Valley, which is the valley of Onondaga Creek, south of the city. And so when they ran out of salt, they mined the salt initially, and they used a lot of salt in the city of Syracuse. But then they sort of started running out of the salt in Syracuse, so they moved south into the Tully Valley, where there were huge salt domes, and they mined salt there. And then they brought it up to the surface, and they ran it into Syracuse. They brought it in this kind of slurry in an open canal up into Syracuse. And they mined out about 35 like that. So it really had an impact on that community. It's still there. I was there last or 2 weeks ago, just visiting with a class of mine. So it's still there. It's in operation right in the middle of the neighborhood. Okay, the next one that I want to talk about, which is a big issue in Syracuse, which we may not think about as an environmental justice issue, but I really think it's important to understand it in that way, which is the building and the rebuild of I-81. I-81, of course, is the big highway that goes right through the middle of Syracuse. And it's important to understand when and why and where I-81 and I-690 were put in. They were put in right through the heart of the city. This old black and white photograph on the left-hand side is a photograph, an aerial photograph prior to the construction of the highways. The highways were constructed in the beginning in the early 60s, 1960s. So this photograph was taken probably in the 30s or 40s, something like that. The photograph on the right is a more recent photograph after the construction of the highways. And you can see that the highways were put in right through the middle of a fairly densely populated neighborhood. So this I-81 right here is basically right along here. It should be right about in there where my cursor is going. And so you can see that that was punched in right through the middle of that. And it looked something like this when they were building it. This is I-81 right by through the middle of Syracuse. And you can see that that neighborhood, I'm going to go back to this photograph, pretty densely populated neighborhood. They just went in with bulldozers and they took out a huge swath of houses. And moved the people out, and they were able to force people out of their houses. In many cases, people were renters, so they didn't have any say. In cases where people owned their houses, they were essentially paid for the cost of moving out, and that was that. And so that was there's another photograph of it right there, the construction. So those highways now go right through the middle of Syracuse, and so what happened is that in a lot of places, a lot of Syracuse, I-81 is basically right in the backyard of where some people live. And so you have noise pollution and air pollution affecting people. I don't have a photograph of this, but the Dr. King School on the south side of Syracuse, one corner of their school is about 50 yards from the highway. So the interstate. And so it's actually right very close, it's very noisy, and there's a lot of things that come off, the dust and road salt and fumes and things like that. So, and there are houses that back up right up to the interstate. So that to me is an environmental justice issue as well for the folks that live there. Another issue that affects people on the south side and elsewhere is lead poisoning. Now, many of you may have heard about the lead poisoning issue in Flint, Michigan, where lead got into the drinking water. A lot of that was because of the erosion of lead pipes. And we have a lot of lead pipes in Syracuse as well. But so far, anyway, the people that run our water system have done a good job of protecting the water system, of using the proper treatment so that our pipes aren't corroded. But in Syracuse, so we don't have a big issue with lead poisoning coming from lead pipes. We do, however, have an issue of lead poisoning coming from lead-based paint. And so this is the picture on the left-hand side, upper left-hand side is a photograph of an old paint can where they used to add lead to paint as sort of a stabilizer, and it was just something that was put into paint, it was put into gasoline, it was put into a lot of industrial products until people realized how contaminating and how dangerous it was. And so laws were passed that said you couldn't any longer put lead in paint. And so lead is no longer put in paints, no longer put in gasoline, but on a lot of older houses, there still is lead-based paint. And in low-income communities in older cities like Syracuse, a lot of houses have lead-based paint still on them. And if you look at houses that, older houses that haven't been maintained as well, where people they're either renters and the landlord hasn't maintained the house, or if people don't have the money to maintain a house and to put in new paint, you oftentimes get lead paint peeling off. And so one of the issues with that is that lead paint, it gets in these little flakes. It actually tends to be a little bit sweet, and children will get it. They'll put it on their fingers. They'll put their fingers in their mouths. They might chew on the lead paint. And so that gets into people's bodies, and especially young children. And lead is really dangerous, especially for kids who are still developing. And that's the biggest issue here. Again, and this is another dot density map, this time of Syracuse, that shows the ethnic makeup of by census block in the last census that we had in 2010. And what you see in this map, white population is blue, the Black or African American population is green, and then the Asian population is red, Latino or Hispanic is sort of a yellow, and then other is brown. And so what you see primarily in this photograph is that or in this map is that the African American population tends to be overwhelmingly in that the south side, south and near west side, south of the highway, right? So this is historically the old 15th Ward, and that's part of the highway. And then over here along 690, right? So if you think back to the redlining map that I showed you, there was one big long stretch of red right in here, and another big stretch over here and over here. So these were the red-lined low-income African communities back in the 1930s, and they still are today. And the bluer areas are less densely populated and whiter populations. And it's in that area, I want you to keep that in mind. Again, right here, this on that red, the south, near west side and the south side of Syracuse is where you have the highest concentration of African Americans. That's also, and this map on the right shows the highest concentration of lead levels, especially among children with elevated lead levels. There's this one neighborhood over here on the near north side as well, which is a refugee and immigrant population, a lot of African Americans, but a lot of refugees and immigrants from around the world there. There's another map that shows basically the same kind of data, slightly differently displayed. And so again, in the African American community on the southwest side, or on the near west side and the south side, is where you have those highest concentrations, with one block up here on the near north side, which again is a low income refugee immigrant population. Okay, the last example that I want to talk about, and I don't have slides of Syracuse, but is climate change and urban heat islands. And I think this is another issue, particularly with increasing effects of climate change. As summers get hotter, what you find is that that affects urban areas. Urban areas, there's a thing called the urban heat island effect, where because of pavement, because of relative lack of tree cover, because more hard surfaces like cement, more highways that are asphalt, They absorb that heat, they re-radiate it, and they tend to be elevated in terms of temperature relative to more rural areas. And so they call that urban heat island. But within urban areas, the heat effect isn't even. It's unevenly distributed spatially and socially. And so if you look again, here's another map that shows ethnic makeup of New York City. And what you find is that the highest area, the highest heat vulnerability index is highest in these areas where you have a large concentrations of African American and Latino populations, up here in the Bronx, over here in Brooklyn. And in these neighborhoods over in Queens, where you get larger concentrations of African American populations. By contrast, Staten Island and Manhattan, that are primarily white populations, are a much lower in temperature, so you don't have that strong effect. So what accounts for that? Here's another map that shows that same thing. This is the heat vulnerability index. This is the just sheer temperature that shows some of that just by temperature. So what accounts for that? A lot of it has to do with greater pavement and lack of tree cover. So it's sort of similar to the maps that I showed earlier of Providence, Rhode Island. In lower income communities, you tend to have less tree cover, less green space, more pavement, more asphalt, and so it just tends to be hotter. You don't have that mitigating effect of green space and forest, and urban forest. Similar kind of process that you have here. This is in Washington, D.C., so that these areas to the north and east of the Potomac River, so this is the Potomac River right here, those tend to be much hotter. And if you look in this map over on the right-hand side, the blue over here is African American, red is white communities, the yellow is Hispanic or Latino. And what you find then is that these areas of hotter temperature, the concentrations of higher temperature, are in the areas where you have a higher density of African American and Latino populations, communities of color. The white neighborhoods, which tend to be wealthier, they tend to be more, have greater tree cover, more parks, and relatively lower temperatures. And then you see this in the city of Richmond, Virginia as well. Remarkably similar kinds of patterns where you have poverty levels. So this is not by race, but it's by poverty. But if I had a map that showed by race or ethnicity, it would map onto here pretty well also. So that you have extreme poverty up here in this kind of north eastern corner, high levels of poverty down here south of the James River. And then you have that, you look over here, the Richmond urban heat island, so the areas of highest temperature increase, you see that maps onto the impoverished areas. So low income communities, these are also communities of color, lower tree cover, lower amount of green space, higher concentrations of asphalt and concrete and things like that cause extreme heat, which in a place like Richmond or New York City with climate change can be really extreme. And so what you find is that as we get those heat waves in the summer that are driven by climate change, and you have periods where temperatures are, for days in a row might be well over 90 degrees or over 100 degrees, or in some cities in the Southwest, they might even be as high as 110 or even higher in some places. And that has a disproportionate effect on low-income communities of color, that they're more exposed to that, to this extreme heat compared to wealthier and whiter communities that you find elsewhere in the city. So that's what I have. I wanted to kind of put up this website in case anybody's interested in getting involved in environmental justice issues here in Syracuse. The Syracuse Environmental Justice League is sort of a clearinghouse. They group together lots of different organizations. So this is a nice website for finding information about environmental justice issues here in Syracuse. So I'm going to end that. I'm going to end my talk, and we can get back to things. So I'm going to stop sharing, and there we go.
All right, that was a great talk. I super appreciate that. Let me open up questions first of all to the students that are here. Any questions or thoughts? A lot of this stuff is stuff I've heard before, but it might be the first time for you guys. What do you think? Any questions?
I went through that really quickly, I know. So if anybody has any questions or clarification or anything at all, feel free to ask.
So last year, my students got really active in looking at, like, we took the Flint, Michigan thing, and then we started to do the redlining with Syracuse, and
Yeah.
we were like doing a self-discovery about the lead paint and like overlapping those maps like you had. And we were, we had Syracuse.com to come in and like talk to us about the articles they'd written. How did the new change in the legislation of the with the change in how the renters, how they have to have the inspections and stuff like that with the lead inspections, how is that impacting the lead? Because I know that was one of the big issues, is that they can actually like essentially keep renting these lead-filled houses. I know Rochester was more proactive and they have less of an issue than us.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I don't really know how that's affected the renters or affected lead. I mean, this is getting information out there to people is really important. But if the lead is still there and people have very limited opportunities, or they're limited in terms of where they can go, they may not, even if they have the knowledge of lead in their house, they may not be able to make alternative choices. But I don't know specifically. I haven't seen any data that about that. Do you know much about that?
All I know is, so we had like legal services was coming in and talking to us about how they were trying to get actual like knowledge to the renters that like, hey, you should test to like even know, like, because a lot, like on the north side, like you were saying, like a lot of them are immigrants that don't even know what lead is, and then they're dealing with the legal ramifications of like their kids now have high lead poisoning. And there was actually like some suppression by the Onondaga County Health Department of like even having the kids tested. And that was like one of those big injustices that like my kids were like, what do you mean? So I know that the city council just like changed like the policy of like, you can't collect rent if you haven't had yourself cleared from like having inspectors come in and test your lead. So that was just like something new just in 2020. So
okay, super interesting. That I haven't seen. Okay, that's great to know. Yeah, I need to sort of update my knowledge on that.
Same. Like, and it's just coming into this year from COVID is like, whoa, what's happened kind of thing. So
yeah, exactly. Okay, cool. That's good to know. Thank you.
So it's kind of scary. Like the asthma pictures in New York City just kind of blows my mind how specific it is to the different neighborhoods, which is it's kind of far for us. But getting closer to home, how about some quick thoughts about Route 81? Is the destruction and the problems caused by Route 81, is that fixable if they do take it down? Or
so I think in this, part of this is an environmental justice issue, and part of it is sort of just a broader economic social justice issue. But I think, my own feeling is that there's, and from talking with people from the South Side, activists would say the Urban Jobs Task Force and other folks like that want it to be taken down, right? So the better folks see it as, like it's a blight on the neighborhood. It's noisy. It cuts right through the neighborhood. It's causes pollution, all of that. But there is a risk of bringing it down. I mean, for one thing, taking it down is going to be a multi-year project. And all of that is going to happen within the community. And so there's going to be a huge amount of machinery, a lot of just dust and debris and noise and things in that community. There's going to be trucks in and out, huge machinery in the community in the South Side. So there's going to be a massive impact, which will probably last a couple of years while they do that work. So one of the things that people are concerned about is like, are people going to get employed? Is there going to be employment available for people from the neighborhood, or is that going to be just yet another instance of people in the neighborhood having these projects go through and without providing any actual economic benefit? So that's one issue that people are concerned about. That's sort of in the midterm. So what's the impact of it going to be? One way or the other, they either have to tear the whole thing down or they have to rebuild it. So there's going to be an impact on the community one way or the other with that. But the other thing that people have expressed a concern to me about, which is less an environmental justice issue and I think more an economic justice issue or social justice, is around the risk of gentrification. Because if the highway is removed and that becomes a boulevard, and then you don't have any longer the barrier between the university and downtown and the South Side neighborhood, there's been, what's going to happen in terms of, say, student housing? Is there going to be more luxury student housing? Is there going to be more sort of high-end development that sort of encroaches on the South Side? So that's a risk. I mean, so part of what people are concerned about is how do you sort of thread that needle with taking down the highway so you remove that, remove the noise, the pollution, all of the issue of having the highway that goes through the neighborhood, impacts the community, but at the same time, keep it from being gentrified, keep the, so that you maintain the community character and provide economic benefit for the community, which is, it's a difficult balance. There's an organization called Urban Jobs Task Force, which has been working on those issues, and they've been great. They actually merged out of, some of the same people that used to be part of the Partnership for Onondaga Creek that fought the placement of that sewage treatment plant on the South Side.
Thank you so much. I know I really enjoyed the talk. I hope the students did. I appreciate the students coming out today for this. I appreciate Dr. Pro giving us his time today. This was amazing.
Okay.
So students, I think all you have left to do is vote for the Halloween contest before 3/20. And I know for me, I got a lot of good information to pass on to my students. And the Syracuse Environmental Justice League, I'm going to pass that on as well. So I appreciate your time.
All right. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.